Hi, welcome to session three of the topic on the Spanish colonization of Texas. So, this is the third and last session of this topic, and we're going to cover in this session the remaining portions of this topic we started last week, again with session one and session two, looking at very briefly the Iberian background of Spanish Texas, looking again the kind of social and cultural institutions and values that the Spaniards are going to introduce in Texas based upon their own historical experiences that we cover very fully. And we also started looking in session two at the process by which the Europeans, and in this case, Spain, of course, is going to play one key role in this process of the age of discovery, the discovery of America. And Columbus, after all, was sponsored by the Spanish kings, Isabella and Ferdinand. And we were looking at the background of this process of discovery that had to do with long distance trade, the emergence of trading networks in the 12th and 13th and 1400s, connecting Europeans with other cultures and civilizations from different continents to engage in commercial exchange, like things like spices, for example, gold, tea, silks, and the like, again, were being exchanged ever since the 12th and 1300s and beyond, which gave rise, again, to mercantilism. We were talking about that, again, the emergence of the first international economic system of the modern era of human history, pretty much. We're talking about world history. So we can see the rise, again, of mercantilism that introduced the idea of gold as money, or the gold standard, which was, again, the currency or the means for exchanging or trading products through those long distance trading networks. So it became money, of course. And of course that set off a gold rush, so to speak, in which now people are looking for gold because this is a way, again, that somebody actually creates wealth. And also trade. Again, mercantilism introduced the idea that that one of the ways that somebody is going to create wealth, which means, of course, accumulate gold, is by engaging in international trade. So trade was becoming the main economic activity for kingdoms, for merchants, for landowners, for anybody that wanted to really create or generate wealth. So again, mercantilism is on the rise. Again, it's transformed agriculture, like commercial agriculture. We see the rise of plantations. People are growing cash crops in plantations for the purpose of exporting those products around the world in order to, again, build wealth, if you will. So we see great changes, of course, taking place in Europe that are going to serve as the engine, if you will, for all the changes that are transpiring particularly in the 14 and 1500s, in terms, for example, of the discovery, the exploration of the Atlantic Ocean in order to find a trade route around Africa to reach the Indian spices. And of course, in this process, we're going to see Columbus, of course, making the journey to America as he's trying to find a trade route to the Asian markets for the spices in India and the silks in China. He's going to stumble upon the Americas, of course, and discover a new world, the American continent. So we also explored, again, the process of the conquest itself. The conquest of the Aztecs provides very valuable lessons for understanding pretty much the kind of encounters that will take place in the 1600s and beyond between the Europeans, of course, and the Native Americans in terms of, again, the kind of technologies. We're looking at steel technology at the end of session two that enabled the Spanish to conquer the Aztecs. We're looking at the role of epidemic disease, for example, as well. And this is a byproduct of trade. Long distance trade is going to make possible the transmission of epidemics across vast regions and continents and so on and so forth. We're looking at that as well. And of course, the Native Americans, of course, are going to be severely weakened by the diseases, unable to, of course, withstand or survive many of those outbreaks because they lack that immunity. So again, this is another lesson. Again, the role of Indian alliances, for example, how the Spaniards are going to make alliances with Indian groups that were resisting Aztec rule. So this is going to be yet another very, very valuable lesson that we learn from the conquest. The role of religious ideas as well among the natives, in which they had certain ideas dealing with the return of ancient gods and heroes that were coming back to restore certain kingdoms that existed in the past. And in that, of course, we're going to see that in many cases the Spaniards were believed to be the return of those gods. And of course, that led, of course, to the defeat of those societies, because many of the leaders, the leadership and warriors and people actually believed, again, that this was an inevitable defeat, if you will. Now, we have to cover one last portion of this segment on the discovery, conquest, and exploration. That, let me share here the the outline here. So again, when we talk about exploration, because it is in the 1500s that the Spaniards are going to engage in massive exploration of the New World. They're going to be the pioneers, the forerunners of the exploration of the Americas, because nobody knew at that time how vast this continent was. So there's going to be exploration taking place for the purpose of tracking the land, the landscape, building maps, identifying the geography, the resources, and also the population, of course, the Native American population as well. So again, the 1500s will be known as the Age of Exploration, again, because this is what Europeans are doing. Of course, the Spanish are pioneering this process before all the other Europeans, that is to say. So again, we have to cover that before we actually move into Texas proper and look at the institutions that the Spanish are going to establish. So very quickly, we're not going to spend more than a few minutes here, just discussing in very general terms the very general terms, the kind of expeditions, again, that took place during this time, that allowed the Spaniards to identify certain regions of North America. And in this case, Texas is going to be part, again, of our study here. So therefore, we have to concentrate on just those expeditions that the Spaniards conducted, in which they identified the region that today we call Texas. And then they're going to then later on, of course, start settling and colonizing once we move into the 16 and 1700s, that is to say. All right. So at any rate, so again, those explorations were really reconnaissance missions. Once again, to map the geography, identify the population, the demographics, if you will, the different groups that inhabited the region, and of course, the pursuit of wealth. And again, mercantilism was very important here for understanding the intentions, the motivations of the explorers in order to undertake such hardships, again, because those were really very hard undertakings, again, surveying new lands, encountering populations they have never encountered. And in this process, of course, sometimes there will be conflict and dangers and so on and so forth. But mercantilism, again, the international economic system from which the Spaniards and the Europeans were coming from, is one in which trade had become the main economic activity for building wealth, and gold itself, of course, is really the source of that wealth. So they're looking for wealth. They're looking for gold, particularly. They're looking for products that can be grown, extracted, produced from this land. Again, riches such as, again, spices, for example. They're looking for trade, items of trade, precious goods or commodities they could extract and export, etc. They're trying to identify, in other words, those resources, land that can be productive for agriculture, for cattle ranching. They're, again, serving the land precisely because this is how they're actually looking at the geography, at the landscape, of course, for commercial purposes. So this is their motivation. Again, they have their own personal motives and names. Of course, because they're coming from the Spanish experience of La Reconquista, they're also very interested in, spreading Christianity. So they feel they're on a mission. And the mission is to evangelize or spread Christianity among the Native American population. So they're taking the cross with them, of course. And they're also looking for personal glory, perhaps engage in a legendary battle or conquest in which they're going to be remembered and for, in the future. And people will sing praises or write poems and so on and so forth, something we already covered, of course, in session 2. So the explorers, the Spanish explorers, are coming from this background. Their motivation is commercial, but it's also religious, and it's also, again, glory, again, of fame as well. Okay? Now, something that we have to understand here, again, very important when we talk about the Spanish exploration of Texas, many of the explorers, Spanish explorers that will be arriving to North America, whether they're arriving to the Gulf of Mexico or to the region that we call Texas today or the Southwest, places like today's New Mexico and so on, there is something that is going to inspire them more than anything else, and that is the experience that Hernan Cortés, the Spanish conquistador of the Aztecs of central Mexico, and the men that accompanied him, the experience of that conquest in terms of their findings, and that is Cortés actually found huge amounts of gold, again, in central Mexico, in Tenochtitlan, the city of what today is Mexico City. It was the Aztec capital, that is to say. It was just, again, amazing. So much of it. Now, the Aztecs, as well as other indigenous groups that collected gold, produced, again, they actually work with metals in many cases, like, things like gold, for example. The Aztecs and the other indigenous groups never used gold as money or as currency. Okay, gold was precious, but because this was something that they used for religious purposes, adorning their temples, decorating the pyramids and their religious altars and so on. This is, something that made the religious temples beautiful for their gods. But they did not use gold as currency, nor did they base their status or their wealth on gold as well. Okay, so there was never really, again, a gold standard, to speak of. The way that mercantilism worked in places like Europe, the Middle East, India, China, those civilizations had already accepted gold, had been using gold for quite a while, by the way, in the past. So they never really, again, used gold as, the Aztecs in this case, never really used gold as money, whereas in the old world, China, India, the Middle East, and Europe had been using gold for centuries, perhaps even a few thousand years, and it was valuable to them. It was considered to be the source of wealth, that is to say. And now it was being traded and used, on an international level, that is to say, in the old world. But here in the new world, the Aztecs had a lot of this gold, and many other indigenous groups do have gold, but don't use it for economic purposes. That is, so this experience of witnessing so much gold in central Mexico left the impression, the Spaniards were left with the impression that this continent was extremely wealthy and rich because of the gold that they saw from the Aztecs. And they were able to see some of it, by the way. So they believed that gold had to be also abundant elsewhere, that there might be other empires. There has to be in this continent other civilizations that also store a lot of gold. So they were now in the search for gold, thinking that there are probably going to be cities, cities of gold, golden cities. There will be fables, as we'll see again, in terms of the Spaniards believing that there's probably cities full of gold, paved with gold, and everything is made from gold, and so on and so forth. This is fable stories, by the way. So this is going to be in the background, again, of their minds, that as they move to North America, they're going to be thinking that we're going to stumble upon some other Aztec kind of empire full of gold. So again, just after the fall of the Aztecs in 1521, when Cortés is able to conquer the Aztecs, finally in the fall of Tenochtitlan, we're going to see that from the Spanish colony of which today is Cuba, which was the first Spanish colony, by the way, there's going to be other expeditions now into North America. There's going to be expeditions into what today is Florida. This is the famous expedition by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. It was a 10-year expedition that spanned between 1528 and 1538. Again, a whole decade. He'll be in a very long expedition. So again, this is not an easy kind of adventure. There's a lot of hardships. There's hunger. There is, hostile, sometimes population that you're going to encounter. There's the climate, things like nature, for example. There are winters and so on that can affect him, and did affect him, by the way. So again, as they reach to Florida, they're going to move around the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, there was a shipwreck, and there will be very few survivors in the Gulf of Mexico, and they had to actually make a stop along the Mississippi River in order to build a few boats to allow them to continue navigating across the Gulf of Mexico along the coastline. They couldn't really move too far from the coastline, and eventually Cabeza de Vaca is able to enter the Galveston Bay area, around Galveston, again, present day Galveston today. Again, so he is going to arrive there and now move into the mainland instead of, again, continue the navigation kind of journey along the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico. He's now moving inland into places like Texas, for example. And he's going to survey, of course, those lands. Very few survivors at this point. There's only 4. There is Cabeza de Vaca and also a Moorish slave, a Moorish African slave known as Estebanico, who accompanies him on this journey into Texas. And of course, he's going to be meeting some Native American groups along the way. And because they appeared as foreigners, their appearance was very different. They're going to be mistaken as also perhaps not necessarily gods or spirits in this case, but as very special beings. Like, for example, that Cabeza de Vaca, for example, was for the natives a medicine man, which, in Native American religious thought, the medicine man was somebody that was actually closer to the spirit world, closer to the gods, somebody who could actually speak to spirits, perform miraculous healings, and so on and so forth. So he's going to actually use that particular idea of the natives to pretty much survive in his journey. Again, it was a very difficult one, by the way, but he's able to actually continue his journey from indigenous community to another. Of course, he's surviving because, again, the indigenous peoples are providing some form of assistance along the way. And he'll come to the Rio Grande area in what today is, the border region between Texas and Mexico. And eventually he's going to move towards the west along the Rio Grande, of course, and reach to areas of what today is called New Mexico, meet the indigenous peoples of New Mexico, gather some knowledge, and now return back to the Central Valley of Mexico by going through the West Coast in the Pacific Ocean again. And now he's going to return finally in 1536, 38. He's now making the full leap back, and he's going to provide a report of his findings, of course, the kind of lands that he visited, like, for example, Texas, New Mexico, and so on and so forth. And there'll be certain reports in which he suggested, again, that there were riches, again, to the north, believing that perhaps the peoples of New Mexico were going to be the ones that will know where golden cities might be, because they were very well established, very well developed. And again, there's going to be this ongoing impression that perhaps in North America, there has to be some form of wealth or golden cities and so on. Of course, a few years later, there will be yet another expedition also sent from Cuba. Hernando de Soto is going to be sent once again to Florida in order to survey the lands north of Florida, by the way. And this is going to be a short-lived expedition that will last for about 4 years, maybe 5 years. And Hernando de Soto is responsible for actually surveying what today is the Mississippi River Valley, again, and parts of what today would be areas of Georgia, and parts of the Carolinas as well, present-day Mississippi, again, as well. All of this region will be surveyed by Hernando de Soto in this expedition. Of course, he doesn't make it back. He dies along the Mississippi River, and the people that accompanied him will have to return and also provide some form of knowledge regarding the societies, the topography, the geography of this region, which, at this point, the impression is they did not really find, the golden cities in North America. They also report that the climate had changed in this region, that it was not as tropical, for example, as the Gulf of Mexico kind of climate of, in Cuba, for example, central Mexico or Florida. So again, this left the impression that perhaps in this region, particularly north of Florida, there's not going to be, sources of wealth. There's not going to be gold and so on and so forth. So there's just, reconnaissance missions conducted by explorers, and yet there will be yet another explorer by the name of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, who will be sent around the same time that Hernando de Soto will visit the Mississippi River Valley and parts of Florida. Around the same years, there will be yet another explorer leaving from Mexico City, Coronado, as he was called, to survey the lands of what today is the American Southwest. Again, so this is the kind of route that he took, and going through, once again, the western coast of what today is present-day Mexico, moving into Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas, the Panhandle, parts of Kansas, and what today is Oklahoma as well. He'll be surveying those lands. And of course, It is here that Coronado takes some missionaries and establishes, again, some religious communities or missions in what today is present day Mexico, New Mexico, New Mexico, which are going to play a critical role in the development of the province, the Spanish province of New Mexico, which in turn is going to influence some of the developments taking place later on in Texas itself. Okay, so again, this expedition was also critical in establishing New Mexico, the Coronado expedition, by the way, also looking for the fabled cities of gold, and they're driven north because the indigenous peoples tell them, again, that gold can be found if they just continue to move north. We don't know whether those reports were made in good faith or maybe the indigenous peoples were just trying to just mislead the Spaniards. We just don't know exactly. But the Spaniards, of course, Coronado, just like Hernando de Soto and Cabeza de Vaca, are really trying to search for yet another Aztec empire in this process. Again, so with that, again, part two, which is the discovery, conquest, and exploration, is fully covered. Now we're moving into part three, and this is the last segment, the last portion of this topic, the Spanish colonization of Texas. That is going to deal now exclusively with now the establishment of the colonial institutions in Texas itself, and looking at one of the main institutions, and also looking at their functions, the role that this played in actually building colonial society, Spanish colonial society in places like Texas. All right, so this is the last portion again. It shouldn't take us long again because we established the basis and foundation for understanding Spanish Texas, in other words, everything we just discussed. Now, before we actually move into Texas itself, let's just very briefly identify the main colonial institutions that the Spanish introduced in New Spain. Yeah, New Spain is pretty much the colony that the Spaniards are building in central Mexico, and that it will extend into the upper reaches of Mexico in what today is Texas and the Southwest, places like New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And New Spain will also extend into the south into the Yucatan Peninsula and parts of Central America, present-day Guatemala. It's a gigantic, of course, colony called New Spain. So let's just briefly look at the colonial institutions that will help us understand the political structures, if you will, the economic and religious structures that the Spanish are introducing that will serve as the basis for shaping Texas in this case. Again, so from 1521, after the fall of the Aztecs in 1521, all the way to the year of where the Independence Revolution begins in 1810, what we see is that the Spaniards are introducing, building certain institutions in order to govern the colony of New Spain, that is to say. So let's look at very briefly the political institutions of New Spain. And again, we have to start with the Viceroyalty of New Spain. This is really the central government of New Spain itself, the Viceroyalty. This is the Viceroy. This is in other words, the representative of the king. So it's monarchical. So we have the representative of the Spanish monarch in New Spain governing on behalf of the Spanish king. And he rules from Mexico City. Again, from Mexico City, we're going to have a vice king, a viceroy, or a vice king, if you will, who is appointed directly by the Spanish monarch. Is more than likely a personal friend again, of the Spanish monarch, who comes from Spain, by the way, and takes office here in Mexico City. And it's a lifetime appointment, by the way. And again, he's responsible for ruling the entire colony of New Spain. Again, and of course, the vice royalty is part of the high level councils that actually govern the colony. One, of course, of those councils is the viceroy himself, the representative of the king, but there's also another body, a high level council that is governing as well, along with the vice king or the viceroy, and that is the audiencia. It's a royal judicial system. It is like a Supreme Court, in other words. And those appointments, the royal judges, in this case, are also appointed by the Spanish king as well. And together, the Spanish judges and the vice king are the ones ruling the colony, all of the colony, of course. Now, just below the viceroy and the audiencia, the Supreme Court, if you will, that pretty much decide on legal matters concerning civil law, for example, criminal law, and so on and so forth, the laws of trade, and so on, commerce, and so on. So just below them, we're going to find, of course, the governors of the provinces. So again, below, we're going to see that there's yet another group of people who are below the hierarchy, of the viceroy and the audiencia, the provincial governors. The colony of New Spain is further subdivided into different provinces. And the one that concerns us here is this province that encompasses, of course, the region of Texas, that was part of a large province, large territory, otherwise known as the Nuevo Reino de León, which includes today Texas, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and San Luis Potosí in Mexico, okay, along the Gulf Coast. And it was part of a larger province, and that was led by a governor. Again, there's a series of governors, of course, that are also appointed by the King of Spain, okay, as well. And they're also coming from Spain as well, again. So this is, again, just to understand that in the formation of Texas, Texas was part of this province, of course, called the Reino de Nuevo León. And again, it was governed by a governor who was appointed by the king, of course. Now, there was yet one more political institution that tells us how the colony is going to be run at the local level, okay? At the local level, because those provinces, well, we're going to see that in each one of those provinces, we're going to see, again, little towns, little settlements and cities, of course, that the Spanish are creating. And it's very slow. It's a slow process of, again, pretty much building towns and settlements and cities. But again, this is going to be very, very important because in every city, we're going to see a city government, okay? A municipal government in which the residents of the city are going to run it. And they're going to run it through a city council that in Spanish were known as the cabildos. Again, a cabildo is a city council, which in turn is the municipal government, the local government. And the people that actually govern the cities through those city councils are actually local merchants, ranchers, and administrators. Once again, the residents of the city run the city council. Again, those are local merchants and traders, They do trade, they engage in commerce within the city and outside. And they have cattle ranches as well, prominent members of the community doing cattle ranching, and also local officials and administrators. They're going to come together, form a council, and run the cities called a cabildo. And of course, the cities were in control of the local population, but not the governorship. The governorship is in control of the King of Spain, as well as the entire colony, if you will, through the viceroy and the audiencia. So this is going to be important, as we'll see, because this is going to create a sense of autonomy and independence within the city itself. The way that the cities are developing, for the most part, in the provinces outside of Mexico City, not in Mexico City, because this is where the viceroy is located. This is little vice king, if you will. It is in Mexico City, but outside of Mexico City, in all of the cities of the colony, the sense is that the cities are self-ruled, self-governed, if you will. Okay, and this is going to be important for understanding much, much later, once we move into the Texas Revolution, for example, or when we look at, for example, the independence of Mexico, that many of the people that participated in the independence of New Spain from the mother country, from Spain in 1810, were people that were coming from the cabildos, from the provinces, from those local merchants, ranchers, and administrators. Okay, so it's extremely important to note. There's also the colonial church. Again, so besides the political institutions that I just mentioned, there's also going to be a central church, also headquartered in Mexico City, that is going to try to establish Catholicism as the official state religion, and the church itself was the central church. Again, it introduced the Spanish Inquisition to enforce Catholicism on Mexico, again, and persecute those that question, again, the church, or did not abide by the rules or the precepts, and so on and so forth. We cover that coming from the experience of La Reconquista, of course. And again, the mission of the church is to evangelize the Native American population. In other words, this is part of the spiritual conquest of the Americas. In other words, that we're here to spread Christianity and make sure that the natives are converted to Christianity again. They're evangelized, in other words. That there's the mission of the church in the New World. And for that purpose, of course, there's going to be thousands upon thousands of Catholic missionaries crossing the Atlantic Ocean from places like Spain. Some of them are coming from Rome, etc., in order to engage in this process of evangelization. Again, Franciscans, Dominicans, and later on there will be Jesuits, also missionaries arriving by the thousands to places like Mexico and across, again, all of the provinces of New Spain, establishing missions. We're going to get to the mission itself again, but this is going to be important because this is a process of colonization. That colonization has to take place in the way that you promote a Catholic identity, in other words, in every region, to bind people together under the rule of the church, but also under the rule of the Spanish king, who is now believed to be divinely ordained by God, in other words. So converting the natives made it easier to turn them into Spanish loyal subjects of the king, who under the Church of Spain and the Church of Rome, the king was once again appointed by God. Okay, so this is going to be one of the central institutions again of colonial society. And of course, the economic institutions, of course, very briefly, the Spanish introduced the plantation as one of the primary economic institutions to, grow things like sugar and tobacco in places like the Caribbean, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, and the southeast portion, the Yucatan Peninsula, and present-day Veracruz, again, parts of Central America as well. Gold and silver, this is another economic institution that is going to develop in places like central Mexico, and the state of San Luis Potosí as well. We're going to see the extraction of gold and silver. And also another very important institution, economic institution, that the Spanish introduced to the New World is the Spanish hacienda, or hacienda again. By the 1600s, beginning in the 1600s, we're going to see the development of an economic institution that was the main commercial enterprise that produced all of the products that the colonists needed. Okay? Because when you talk about mining and the plantation enterprises, those were export-led enterprises. In other words, those are products that the Spanish are extracting or producing for exports. But the Spanish hacienda is directly to the internal economy for domestic purposes, for the internal economy of New Spain, to produce the needs, the products of basic necessity that the colonies demanded and required to sustain the towns, to sustain the settlements, the cities, the ports, etc. For example, again, the colonies needed food, again, and so this is going to be the hacienda, a place where there's going to be farming activities. So again, this is one of the very important elements, again, of the Spanish hacienda, in that, again, we cannot just describe it in just one single term, because the Spanish hacienda were like three types of enterprises mixed in one, in that this is an enterprise in which people are growing food, so it's a farm. Okay, they're growing things like, for example, grain, for example. Okay, you're growing things like corn, you're growing things like rice or wheat. Eventually, of course, it will be grown. Beans and squash and vegetables, everything that the colonists required. Okay. Also, the hacienda included ranching. Okay, cattle ranching and animal farms. It's not just a farm in the sense that people are just growing crops to sustain populations, but also they're actually grazing cattle. They're growing animals like sheep, goats, poultry, and so on, in order to supply, meat, beef to the colonists as well. So again, this is another component of the hacienda that, besides being a farm, it's also a cattle ranch in the same complex, and also it is a factory. Again, this is yet another dimension, another very important part of the Spanish hacienda, is that it's a factory as well, because this is a place in which artisans and weavers and so on are actually manufacturing, if you will, the products that the colonists needed, like clothing, hats, shoes, boots, you name it. Okay. Horseshoes, etc., and the like. Again, so it's also a kind of a small factory or manufacturing kind of enterprise mixed along with the ranch and the farm. So again, it's a large complex that involves three things: farming, ranching, and manufacturing. And of course, they're in the process of producing everything that people require for their daily use and their daily living, whether it's food, products, or like beef, for example, like a meat market. Everything's coming from the hacienda, again, in your local supermarket. And also things like textiles, dyes, leather, chocolate, and so on and so forth. Another very significant, again, aspect of the hacienda is that the local population, the Native Americans, had to provide labor to the hacendado, in other words, the hacienda owner. Okay, so every hacienda was owned by the hacendado, the hacendado. That is to say, let me just write it here. The hacendado. The hacendado is the actual owner, again, the landlord, if you will, who is not only, again, in charge of those operations of cattle ranching and farming and manufacturing, but that the people that work there, okay, in the farming, in the ranching, and in the manufacturing, are actually locals and Native Americans in many cases who have to provide labor to the hacendado. Those were called feudal dues. So we talk about feudalism again back in Spain, in which again there is people that actually pay tribute to their lords in the form of protection, sometimes with products that they produce. Again, but here in this part of the world, in New Spain, what happens is that this tribute was paid in the form of labor. Okay, and so 2 days out of the week, you have to go to the hacienda and work the land of the hacendado, or work in the ranch, or produce some textiles, etc. So people had to provide that kind of tribute, provide that tribute to the hacendado, the owner, again, in order to make the hacienda work. So it was actually a feudal, if you will, enterprise. It was a commercial enterprise in that it was really producing all of the products for the local market. It is true, but the labor that was involved in the hacienda was not wage labor. And then again, the hacendado was paying wages again to workers, but rather it was tribute that was paid to the hacendado in order to pay for protection. The hacendado will protect the people and so on and so forth. But in return, people had to work there a day or two out of the week. And a rotation again, there were, some groups that worked this day and other groups came in this other 2 days and so on. It was a rotation labor system, if you will. Okay, so again, extremely important to note. Okay, so now let's look at Texas itself. Now that we understand the main political, religious, and economic institutions, let's look at the Spanish settlement of Texas. All right, so the Spanish in central Mexico are not going to really settle in the region that we call Texas until quite late, from the perspective of how early they began the process of colonization in central Mexico back in 1521. So the first place that the Spanish gained full control and that they colonized and started building provinces and so on that were fully populated by Spaniards and others is the Central Valley of Mexico. Although they explored and claimed regions in North America, which were actually governed, those provinces, the regions they divided into provinces and were governed by the governors. Nonetheless, the fact is that the northern frontier, places like Texas, for example, is not going to be settled until the mid 1600s, around 1659. We're going to see the beginning stages for the settlement of Texas by the Spaniards, and this process is going to unfold and continue until 1810 or thereabouts. Okay, so they're going to introduce four main type of institutions that are going to be key for understanding the formation of Spanish Texas. The missions, which come first, and almost in that order, give and take. The presidios just come just along the missions. Sometimes they go hand in hand, by the way. The garrison, in other words, the fort, the military fort. Then the ranchos or ranches, cattle ranches, and also the towns again. So those are the main four type of institutions that are going to be introduced from 1659 all the way to 1810. And thereby, of course, colonizing Texas. Now, why the Spanish delayed colonization in the northern frontier had to do with certain factors, like the environment was very arid, very dry. It was an arid environment in which the initial explorations, again, undertaken by Coronado, for example, or Cabeza de Vaca, provided reports that even though there were areas that were extremely, very well suitable for agriculture and cattle ranching, might be very productive, etc. The fact is that there were other areas that they considered to be very dry, not desert-like. We're not talking about deserts, but they were arid. And so that factor, uh, combined with the factor of the nomadic tribal groups, for example, in Texas, like the Comanches, for instance, or the Apaches, who were hunters and gatherers, very fierce-like and very warlike, that actually disincentivized the colonists living in the Central Valley of Mexico from moving up north. Because they will say, no, I mean, if you really expect to gain very productive, very fertile lands, you have to be in central Mexico. This is where the good land is, the good soil. The weather is very nice. It rains, has plenty of water, and so on. So why would you move up north? Is just too arid, too dry, too cold, and there's what they will say barbaric, tribes always raiding you, menacing you, and of course, this really disincentivized, of course, colonization and settlement. Many colonists didn't want to leave central Mexico, as a matter of fact, to move up north. So again, the Spanish are going to, in a certain sense, kind of delay or abandon the process of colonization until by the 1600s, they're going to become more and more motivated to start now increasing their presence in the northern frontier as a result of, as we'll see, the incursion of the French. We're going to see in just a few minutes how the French are going to be expanding their control in certain areas of the Gulf of Mexico, seizing lands that were actually claimed by the Spaniards in what today is the state of Louisiana. And that, of course, is going to push the Spanish to actually now increase their presence in Texas to kind of halt, if you will, the French advance in North America. Okay, so let's look at the institutions. The main colonial institutions that the Spanish are going to introduce that are going to establish a society, a colonial society, okay, and full colonial society in Texas. So if we start with the mission, the Spanish mission, again, so this is the forerunner of colonization. Again, the mission, again, this religious institution is going to facilitate Spanish colonization of an area that had not yet been developed. Why? Well, because the missionaries that are going to be sent to those regions had the mission, of course, to evangelize, to convert the Native American population. But what that actually meant was that this conversion to Christianity was a form of acculturation and pacification. That is to say, you're turning natives into Spanish subjects. You're acculturating them. You're spreading this Spanish culture, the language, for example. It's not just the religion. You're also spreading the language itself, the Spanish way of life, Spanish customs, and so on. The Spanish mind is also being disseminated through this Catholic instruction, this Catholic identity that you're promoting. And that is going to pacify the natives and turn them into more loyal subjects. That is to say, because the idea is that you're going to civilize them, okay? You're going to spread civilization, Spanish civilization. That is to say, so again, this is very important that before you start sending people over, like to create towns or enterprises, you first send the mission. Okay, the missionaries. And through the process of conversion, you're preparing the area for further colonization, that is to say. Okay, so there are Dominican, Franciscans, there will be Jesuits, of course, that will be sent. And of course, they're going to build the mission. This is just a layout of the mission itself, as you can see. Again, it had a convent. It had a huge patio on the back where there will be, again, an animal pen for animal farming. It'll have a church, apartment complex where the friars, the monks are going to live. Again, They're going to live there, and this is going to be the place from which they're going to bring in Native American peoples into the convent, into the mission, so they can be turned into Christians, and in this process, again, acculturate them into the Spanish way of life. And so this is central. This is, again, the first step towards colonization. And the main functions of the Spanish mission was, as again, convert the Native American population through, instruction itself. The doctrine was called catechism. Again, you indoctrinate them, if you will. You teach them the Catholic doctrine to them. And then when they're ready, they take certain sacraments like baptism. So by baptizing them, you are thereby now initiating them into the religion. They're now welcome as new members of the church. They gain membership, that is to say, inside of the church. And also, the missionaries are using a strategy in which they convert the natives by association. It's called conversion by association, in which, in many cases, the conversion is not necessarily the process of instilling new ideas in their minds, but rather trying to get them to associate their own indigenous gods with the Christian saints and virgins. Okay? In other words, look, your rain god, okay, can be seen as Archangel Michael, okay, or the earth and moon goddess can be seen as the Virgin of Guadalupe or the Virgin Mary. For Native Americans, the Virgin of Guadalupe was far more meaningful because she looked indigenous, okay, in her appearance. So again, this is what's called conversion by association. The sun god that the natives worship was portrayed as Christ, for example, okay? So many of the hunting and fertility spirits and gods that natives prayed to and worshipped were now presented as the Catholic saints in many cases. So this facilitated, if you will, the process of conversion, because the natives could now identify their own gods in those Christian saints, those Christian images and crosses and so on and so forth. So this gave rise, then, this process of conversion in Texas as elsewhere, to something called Indian Christianity. Okay, Indian Christianity. What today we simply call folk Catholicism. In other words, there's mainstream Catholicism. This is what the Spaniards, again, practiced at this time, the colonists and so on. That's just mainstream, formal, again, official Catholicism. But there's also folk Catholicism, and this is the Catholicism of the Indian masses, if you will. It's called Indian Christianity, in which what the Indians are actually worshiping is their gods of nature in the form of Christian saints and virgins. Okay? And they have their own interpretations, their own meanings that are different and unique from the meanings of the colonists. In other words, the Indians see Christ as the sun god. Okay? They see the Virgin of Guadalupe as the earth goddess, for example. Okay? And many of the Christian saints are actually just their own gods. The gods of rain, the gods of agriculture, fertility, you name it, rain, and so on. So another aspect of this Indian Christianity, again, that is very, very prominent here in Texas as elsewhere, is how natives view the crosses, the images, and the statues. And for them, those are not just symbols, okay? The crosses, images, and statues of the Christian saints, they're endowed with spirit power, okay? They're animated. The crosses have power, They believe that those objects are not just objects. They have a spirit essence and a power within them that if you touch them, you can experience things like healing and miracles and so on and so forth. So the statues can move. The statues can choose where they want to be. The statues have miraculous powers. They can talk. They can listen to you. They can cry, and so on. Because this was part of their worldview and animism. They see things animated, having a spirit of their own. And the Christian icons are not just icons; they're also animated as well. So it's part of this folk Catholicism that we're going to see that is barely being studied and understood by scholars, is that when we look at the process of conversion of the Native American peoples, we don't know exactly what conversion is until we actually delve deeper into the world of meanings. What the natives see in those crosses, what they see in those images. And once we study that in depth, we start revealing again that the natives see their own gods, the forces of their universe, their goddesses are in those images again. So this is not European Catholicism, this is Indian Catholicism, if you will, or Native American. Also, another function of the mission was to transform the natives into Spanish through, again, literacy, teaching them how to read and write in Spanish, teaching them how to grow their own food, things like farming. Okay, many of them were hunters and gatherers. Again, so they were introduced into the knowledge of growing your own food, crops, so on, attending gardens and so on. Animal husbandry, taking care of animal farms, raising cattle and other animal species, for food production as well. And vocational skills, like, trades, some cooking, baking, weaving, artisan work, and so on and so forth, which of course prepare them to enter the life of the Spaniard, if you will. Okay. Another function, again, of the Spanish mission was to dispense the sacraments and rites to the Spanish colonists. In this case, because the Spanish colonists, in many cases, in those provinces, like, for example, in Texas, the Texas province, in those little settlements and towns, like, for example, Laredo, La Bahia, San Antonio, for example, Goliad, and so on, they require a church that will be administering the sacraments to them, like baptism, marriage, and death. And the mission fulfilled that role. The mission provided the sacraments to the Spanish settlers, to the Spanish colonists in Texas. And there will be 26 missions established in Texas, again, in this process of colonization of Texas. Again, so about 26 missions established between 1659 and about 1795, all scattered across, of course, the central portion of Texas, East Texas, and also parts of West Texas as well, each accompanied, of course, by, for the most part, a presidio, a garrison. This is another very important, of course, institution we're going to see in just a few minutes. But here, in order to just fully understand the mission itself, particularly in Texas again, is how the natives responded to the Spanish mission in this case, because it was directed primarily at converting the natives. Okay, so the natives responded in two distinct ways. One is called accommodation and adaptation. In other words, they adapted and kind of accommodated to the mission itself because they saw in the mission a source for protection from neighboring Indian groups that were very hostile and had been very hostile in the past. So they saw the mission as a source of protection, taking shelter during migrations. Native Americans in Texas were still accustomed to be migrating according to the seasons, and they will take shelter from time to time. And also because it provided us a source of subsistence, because of the animal products, the farming that was taking place there, the fathers, as they were called, were growing their own food. So they saw that as a source of sustenance as well, subsistence, in other words. And so, there were specific groups that actually, used the mission for accommodation and adaptation. Those were the Humano groups of West Texas, around the area today we call El Paso, the Carancagua and the Coahuilteca around the Rio Grande Valley, and again, central portions of Texas, from the San Antonio area and also Corpus Christi area. Again, they were the ones that adapted, if you will, and accommodated to the mission itself. But again, there were others that actually resisted Spanish rule, like the Comanche, the Wichita, and the Caddo Indians of the central and northern portion of Texas, that are going to remain pretty much in resistance to Spanish rule, and unwilling to settle any agreements or negotiation for acculturation. So they refused to acculturate, and instead they appropriated European war technology like horses and muskets for warfare, and use then those horses and muskets to their advantage to continue fighting the Spaniards for many years to come, across, of course, the colonial period. The largest resistance effort of the natives happened actually in New Mexico, in the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, in which all of the Native Americans revolted against the missionaries and pretty much halted, at least for a time, the process of colonization by the Spaniards in New Mexico province. Again, it's called the Pueblo Revolt. It was a massive, Indian uprising that pretty much overthrew the leadership of the missions and pretty much destroyed many of those missions in the process. Native Americans are not all acculturating and accepting acculturation and conversion. In many cases are resisting. The second institution is the Spanish Presidio, the garrison or fort that accompanied many of those missions. So whenever a mission was built, more than likely there will be a presidio or a garrison. You can see here, this is the layout. It was a military fort, or a garrison, if you will, that was built almost side by side with the mission. And again, the functions of the presidio was, again, to pacify hostile Indians. The Comanche and the Apache sometimes raided the missions, even though they were at war with each other. There was never an alliance between those two groups. They, on their own, conducted raidings, if you will, against the Spanish missionaries, and they were there to pacify them, halt the French encroachment. We talked about how France was already colonizing areas of the Gulf of Mexico and building the colony of Louisiana, French Louisiana, and establishing, of course, a permanent presence by 1684. We see La Salle, the French explorer, arriving to East Texas, trying to make incursions into Texas proper. As New Orleans is built in 1689, the Spaniards are now in great need to establish some form of military presence again in Texas itself and build a series of forts to prevent the further expansion of the French into this Texas province, of course. So again, this is yet the French Louisiana factor, as it is called, was another factor that led for this expansion of the Presidio, Spanish Presidio. Encourage immigration by providing protection. This is another factor. In other words, that in order for colonists to feel safe, to feel secure, to come to Texas and settle, let's say from places like central Mexico, well, the Presidio served that function to encourage immigration. Look, there's now the presence of forts, in Texas. So you can come here, very nearby a fort, and with that, there's going to be some form of protection from the hostile Indians, that is to say. And also, number 4 is that the Presidio also stimulated the local economy because they employed labor. In other words, there was construction work that needed to be done, or the products that the presidio required, of course, required laborers, artisans, for example, gardeners, bakers, and so on. And they employed the local citizens of this little settlement or town. That was a source of employment, if you will. The people in the presidios consumed local products. In other words, the products that other producers in the towns created, they will often buy those products for their own needs. And of course, over time, the missions and the presidios will all be interconnected through a system of roads that will allow interregional trade. That will take place across the Texas province, because now there's roads that are connecting the missions and the presidios together, and this network allows still for more economic stimulation, in that now there's going to be interregional trade, there's products coming back and forth, and this is going to allow for, of course, Texas to become more and more interconnected with the colonists to the south, moving into what today is present-day Mexico, by the way. So this is, again, beginning the process of development. Settlement, and also protection and development of the region. The third institution I want to discuss is the ranch, the Spanish ranch. We talked about in session 1 how cattle ranching, again, is going to become part of the Spanish tradition, going back thousands of years when cattle was actually used for hunting, for providing food to the peoples, the ancient peoples of Iberia, and of course the bullfight itself, again, will become a major tradition. So again, grazing cattle will become, of course, part of the Spanish heritage. This is something that the Spanish introduced to the New World. Ranching itself, the Spanish brought all the knowledge, and even the cattle itself, the species of animals that will be used for cattle ranching. And they're going to initiate, of course, ranching in Texas itself, the Texas Ranch. And some of the things to keep in mind here, as we're going to now describe the Texas Ranch, is that, again, the Texas Ranch was not just a place where the rancher and the family was just simply grazing cattle and driving cattle. But rather it was a larger complex. Okay, we mentioned, for example, the hacienda, again, in the past, in just a few moments, and that it was, again, a kind of a complex that constituted many things like farm, manufacturing, and also cattle ranching. So in a similar fashion, the Texas Ranch was a place in which people attended several types of animal species. Again, it was not just cattle, even though that was the main species of animal, of course, but also horses, ox, mules, pigs, sheep, goats, and poultry. Again, so it was a vast, commercial enterprise that involved various species of animals, one of which cattle was the most important, but also, again, there was the necessity to attend to the need for other species of animals that serve for transportation purposes, like horses and ox, for example, for ox carts, but also for providing meat to the growing populations and the settlements in Texas. Now, in 1689, the Spanish introduced the first species of cattle and horses and mule into Texas. So this is the starting point where it all began. Like Alonso de Legon expedition in 1689, he brought, hundreds of species, again, of whether different types of horses and mules and cattle, and pretty much left them to roam on the wild, on the Texas countryside, wherever he went, in different creeks and rivers and so on, so they can actually propagate and reproduce. Then when the missions were now propagating in Texas, the missions were also introducing cattle ranching in Texas. They initiated the process of cattle ranching in the mission itself. So before there were any significant land grants awarded to individuals to create cattle ranches, the missions pioneered, again, the cattle ranch itself. And the reason to that is, again, to provide beef to the local population. Now, of course, there were already hundreds, if not thousands, of cattle and horses and mules roaming around, of course, the countryside, some of which are going to be hunted and adopted by the Native American groups, for example. But most importantly, as more and more newcomers arrive to Texas, what we're going to see is that many of the newcomers are going to seize the opportunity that there were thousands of cattle wild, running in the wild, and horses, in order to capture them and build a small ranch. So we're going to see the rise of small ranchers in Texas as we move into the 1700s. Those were just civilians that built ranches from lost cattle. There was just so much of it, again, that pretty much reproduced on their own after Alonso de Leon came and distributed all of those species. But by the time civilians are arriving after the presidio is established, now they're going to be establishing their own little cattle ranches. Again, there'll be a cattle boom, particularly in places like La Bahia in San Antonio, present-day San Antonio, Bexar, or Bejar, as it was called, again, which is going to become the hub, the cradle of Texas ranching in this province, of course, because, again, there were just so much cattle that people are going to seize, domesticate, and bring it into their own private property, and of course, and build their own little enterprise called cattle ranching for providing beef or meat to the local populations. Again, so this led to the rise of capitalism. Ranching led to the rise of capitalism in Texas in the 1700s because, again, we're going to see the formation of cattle markets and cattle trails in places like Nuevo León and Coahuila to the south of Texas in the 1750s, and also in Louisiana, French Louisiana in 1770s. Again, what we're going to see is that there were now huge markets in which people are going to now drive their cattle there and sell it again and actually build wealth, that is to say. Okay, so this is going to start creating wealth in Texas itself because the cattle ranchers are driving their cattle either south into Mexico or east in Louisiana. And later on, when Louisiana becomes part of the United States in 1803, we're going to see that Texas is going to now connect with the U.S. economy and likewise continue the cattle boom in which we're going to see now the rise of rancher entrepreneurs. Again, this is part of this growth of capitalism, if you will, that there's now entrepreneurs, ranchers that are now making huge fortunes from this cattle boom in which they're now selling it again in Louisiana or in Mexico, and they're going to build, of course, their individual wealth. The ranch will be turned into private property, and those are the cornerstones, of course, of capitalism, is that this is going to be the introduction of this idea of private property and individual wealth as part of a new economic system. Individuals own property, and from that property, they create an enterprise in order to build wealth. Again, so this is the beginning stages of capitalism in Texas, in Spanish Texas, towards the 1700s, with cattle ranching. Of course, the division of labor. That in order to make cattle ranching possible, ranchers hired, if you will, specialists, those that were working inside of a ranch, in the corrals, etc., in the operations, and they were being paid wages. And again, by dividing labor and paying wages, and there were administrators and so on, we're going to see the formation, of course, of social classes as well. So ranching itself was a very important institution that not only provided the food, the beef that the populations require, but this is transforming the economy of Texas into a capitalist economy, very gradually, that is to say. The last institution is the Spanish town. This is the last institution. Again, that the formation of towns, population centers in Texas, and there were four main ones. Again, even though there were so many different small settlements, there were, ranching, communities, if you will, missions and presidios. There were four main population centers, of course, that the Spanish established in colonial Texas, and that is Nacogdoches in East Texas, La Bahia, San Antonio, and Laredo. And they range anywhere between 1,500 to 4,000 inhabitants each. That is to say, again, so we're not talking about gigantic cities. Those were actually towns, but they were densely populated compared to let's say, presidios and missions that were just populated by a couple of hundred people and so on and so forth. Again, so Texas colonial society, very quickly, which were the main groupings here, and the people that actually lived in those towns were composed of different groupings. For example, they were the Indians. They're called neophytes, in which they were the converts, people that were actually being converted, acculturated. That was one group of people that would live in those Spanish towns. The missionaries themselves were also another grouping you will find. The presidio personnel and their families, in other words, the Spanish soldiers and their families, constitute yet another grouping of the Spanish town. Also, merchants and traders, people engaging in trade, people, selling products and so on. They constitute a distinct group as well. Within the towns, there were artisans, day laborers, trade specialists, again, that constituted yet all different groupings, of course, local producers, manufacturers, and, and people that work for a daily pay and so on and so forth, and the local administrators. Of course, the local administrators constituted yet another grouping of those Spanish towns. Once again, we're not talking about cities. Those were actually towns in which you can see the different social groups that live there, of course, in Spanish Texas. Now, of course, the Spanish are going to further subdivide those groups into different castes. Okay, the castes of Spanish colonial society. In other words, what the Spanish are going to do, starting in the 1600s and moving into the 1700s, is divide the people of New Spain, and of course, divide all of the colonists that live in the other colonies of Spain to the south of New Spain into different racial categories for the purpose of dividing people in terms of labor. Okay, so they introduced the idea of, racial categories that were virtually non-existent at this time anywhere in the world. You're not going to find people referring to people that look different from you as different races, that is to say. I mean, that concept was literally non-existent. But it's here in the Americas that the Spaniards are going to formulate categories that they believe to be, of course, racial categories for the purpose of dividing, of course, colonial population. And of course, we got the Peninsulares, again, that are really, again, the noble Spaniards born in Spain. Those are the people that are born in Spain, appointed by the king to hold the highest political and religious office of New Spain, heads of the church, the archbishops, bishops, for example, in New Spain, the viceroy, the governors, for example. There are peninsulares, they were called. Again, and even foreign trade merchants, once again, they constituted a separate group of people that performed certain functions, certain jobs, in other words, in the colony of New Spain. And of course, they were far removed from Texas because they were in Mexico City for the most part, the Peninsulares for the most part. Although there were from time to time the visitations, if you will, of foreign trade merchants or perhaps, high-level administrators from time to time into Texas. And those were Peninsulares, again, that from time to time will visit. But this was not something that was witnessed or seen very often. Now, there's a group of people called criollos, the Creoles, again, which in Spanish category meant Spaniards born in America. Okay. The only difference between a Peninsular and a Spaniard is that this Spanish person was actually born in America and not in Spain. And those were the wealthy local merchants, the hacendados, the owners of the haciendas, ranchers for the most part. A great many of them were actually criollos, as they were called, planters, people that own plantations in south of Mexico, for example, or mines in Mexico City, for example. And also people that were holding office locally, local office, and also the lower clergy and the people administering the sacraments, again, the priests, for example, the monks, if you will, that were Spaniards that were born in America. And of course, for them, for the criollos, in order to move upward in the social ladder, it was quite difficult because it was well set. Either you're a Spaniard born in Spain or one born in America. Saying, there's no access, if you will, to a higher ladder other than maybe marriage. So social mobility was possible if you marry into the peninsulares. If you're a criollo, a Spaniard born in America, you marry a peninsular, you will be escalating upward in the social ladder, and that will actually provide you with access for wealth or resources, for international trade, etc. You will position your family in a higher footing, if you will. Okay, so again, you marry them for prestige as well. Okay, and this is something that, again, we're going to see in Texas, in that there will be the criollos, of course, in charge of the cattle ranching, for example, local officials, but their aspirations was to climb the ladder, but perhaps marrying their families into the families of peninsulares, of course. I mean, this is another issue. There's another category, one's called Indios or Indians again, and this is a category reserved for Native Americans, of course. And again, then they're going to be relegated, of course, to work the land, to serve the presidios, to serve the missions, and to provide labor for the haciendas, and so on and so forth. Another quite a category, but yet there were other categories that emerged in this time called mestizos. Mestizos are people that have mixed ancestry of Spanish and Indian. Okay, they're born from Spanish or Indian parents, and they have mixed, ancestry, if you will, and they're going to be in a kind of in-between world between the indigenous population and the criollos, because they're mixed, in other words. And so in Texas itself, we're going to see that Spanish ancestry was key for social mobility if you were a mestizo. In other words, if you're a mestizo, you want to claim that your ancestors were Spanish more than indigenous, because that will move you upward in the social ladder. And that's what happened to many of the cattle ranchers, even though that the vast majority are criollos, Spanish born in America. The fact is that some of them were actually mestizos, but they aspired to a higher status by claiming a more direct link to Spanish past, Spanish families. They will highlight the fact that they descended from such and such family, which are Spaniards, because, that last name will actually grant them access to a higher status in Texas. So again, status came with your category. And of course, mestizos are trying to connect more and more themselves with the Spanish than with indigenous people, because that's, again, the moving upward. Of course, African slaves as well. There's a limited presence. There's just a handful of African slaves present. There's another category that are present in East Texas, because the French Louisiana is engaged in the production of sugar plantations through the use of slave labor. We're going to see the introduction of African slaves into East Texas. They're not going to play a key role, not yet, not until we move, of course, into the national period and beyond, of course. But again, very quickly, town culture, very quickly, what people in the towns were doing, what was important to them, was their pastimes, their leisures, and so on and so forth. What was meaningful for them? Well, bullfights. It's called corrida de toros. Again, part of the Spanish heritage we talked about. Again, this is something that people, do for entertainment. They create fiestas, bullfights, and the townspeople meet, participate, they cheer, they bond, they come together as members of the same community, of course. This is very important. This was part of the Spanish legacy. We talked about horse racing as well. Again, this is another aspect of the town culture as well. This is how, the forms of entertainment of the Spanish towns as well. There's the Catholic religious fiestas. Of course, they're very important. Perhaps the most important are the Catholic celebrations. The Virgen de Guadalupe on December 12th. The celebration of the Virgen de Guadalupe was important because this is a virgin that reminded the indigenous peoples as well as the mestizos of their Indian heritage, because the image was very, very, very Native American like. And so the Native American population associated the Virgin of Guadalupe with the earth goddess and also the moon goddess. So this is going to be one of the main celebrations, of course, of Spanish towns, and also the corridos and fandangos. Corridos are folk songs, and fandangos are dances, which also provided for celebrations, for festivities, and so on. And this is, again, part of the culture, again, of Spanish Texas. So we come to the end of this second topic, the Spanish colonization of Texas. And in sum, again, what we just we recall, or we have to remember, the most important parts here, again, is like we covered again in session one for the most part, the Iberian background. Again, you have to become extremely acquainted with, of course, the Iberian background of Spanish colonial Texas in ways that you will be able to understand Spanish history and how Spanish culture and society was shaped in certain moments of Spanish history that are going to mold the mindset of the Spanish colonists when they're coming to Texas and how they're going to build their society. So this is very important. We covered long distance trade and mercantilism as to be the driving force behind the discovery, conquest, and exploration of America by Spain, and of course of Texas as well. And also, when we're looking, of course, at the very end as the colonization of Texas, how the mission served as the civilizing factor in Texas. So you have to know all the institutions that we covered, the mission, the presidio, the ranch, and also the town. But again, in here, the mission served as a very significant, crucial factor in the civilizing or transformation of the indigenous groups in Texas. So again, this is the end of this topic. The study questions are already available at the very end. So you can go to the Blackboard, to the folder that says lecture outlines and questions. You will find all of the questions there. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is the end of this topic. That's all I have for you. And then on Wednesday, we begin a whole new topic. We're moving into the Mexican background of